Alright, so today we're going to talk about multi-tenancy authorization, which is kind of like the next step to like this multi-tenancy piece that we were talking about. Now, what's interesting about this class is that I don't think it's like the value of this class isn't limited to just multi-tenancy. It can like if you start to get into like where there's like several different roles within your application, this could be useful. So it's not limited. Like take the solution we're going to discuss here and like code out today is going to be beneficial in multiple contexts. You might have to bend it a bit to make it work for what you're trying to do, but I think the principles and the concepts here I think should be pretty clear by the as we start going through like how it might be useful for you. So I want to start off with a little bit of a discussion around how the implementations that you've done in the past might be limited in terms of like roles and handling that. So up until this point, how have you handled roles?
One approach was to use enums
Cool.
and just having like some kind of role thing in the database that could be a 0, 1, 2, 3, and then enums tell you what each role is.
Awesome.
User, admin, whatever.
So like a users table, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like your ID, your name, whatever. And then you might have a role column. And you might see something like 0 or 1 or 2 or whatever. And this would correspond to, inside the user model, you would have like enum. I always forget the syntax exactly for this.
It's like bracket.
Is it role or like role?
I think
Yeah.
And it points to like an array of things,
Yeah.
right? So it'd be like
no, it's a hash.
hash?
It's
It's an array, right?
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I think this is a hash here. Like so you get your like key that points to
Got it.
To a value of
a value of the array, something like that. I don't know. Syntax isn't super important.
Right, yeah.
Admin, and then maybe it's like registered. Oops.
And then like manager. Or something.
Sure. All right. Cool. And then like these correspond to like the indexes in the database. So like this would be like the admin. This person would be registered, and this person would be manager. Right. What are the limitations with this approach?
I think it kind of like strictly defines what permissions they have, because
Sure.
there's no like, what if there's somebody in between a registered user and a manager that needs some access to like one manager permission but doesn't need the rest of them or something like
Cool.
that. Like you strictly define that now, and it's kind of hard to mix.
Awesome.
It means that they're one thing everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that every part of the site they go to, they're always going to be admin or registered or manager. or
Exactly.
whatever it is.
Yeah, and that I think is like those two things is like that's a big problem with this approach is that like we have only one role, can't be anything else. And the reality is that in life and in a lot of companies, like we can be a lot of things at the same time, right? So like at a company you might have someone who might be a manager, but only a manager of their team. So it might be possible for them to see like salaries maybe of the people that are on their team, but not necessarily the salaries of someone else like on a different team. And maybe you have like an HR manager who has like HR permissions where maybe they can see the salaries of everyone within the organization. But then they're also the manager of their team, and so they can see like certain content for their team, right? And so we might need to pull in different roles and like abilities based on how like complex organizations might be structured and stuff like that. And then, so in those scenarios, it becomes really tricky with this current approach to like make it possible for someone to have more than one role. A possible solution to this is to kind of like do something similar to enum, but a little bit different. And that would be like you could have placeholders like that are 0s and 1s. This could be admin. This could be registered. I'm writing really small, sorry. But like, get the idea, right? Like each of these digits would be a placeholder for like whether they were this role or not. What's bad about this?
It'd be like a pain to track.
Yeah.
Keep track of it.
Yeah, it's not very human readable, right? Like now you have to like go through, look up exactly what the roles are, figure out exactly the places for each of those.
I don't, well, if you
Yeah.
want to keep going,
Yeah, we'll come back to that in just 1 second. Then what's the positive thing about this? Like what's a good thing?
It doesn't take up a lot of storage.
Exactly, right? We don't have to go across multiple tables. It's like a pretty fast lookup. So there is like an advantage to doing this. This is actually the way that we used to do it in the old days, before we had like more hard drive space and more speed and all that. Like now hardware is a lot better. We don't really have to be super concerned about this anymore. But this is like how a lot of people would approach this kind of problem back in the day. Now, I think the most common approach to this is to have a separate table that stores like the roles, and then have a like normalize that data and have like foreign keys reference those roles. That's the route I'm gonna show today. You don't necessarily need a roles table, but you would probably need another table to store the association between the user and then the role. I'll kind of sketch that out in just a second here. Did you have
That was kind of my
Yeah.
question. Was like that user like references that table to say like, and then you could even go even deeper and say like I'm a manager of this store, or like I'm a manager of just this team.
Yeah.
You know, and like reference it that way. But that seems similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, you can totally do that, and there's actually some advantages to doing that. So like I know some like consultancies and stuff, when they're building software, they'll make sure that they take, rather than having like the admins stored inside the users table and having like a flag in there to like decide whether they're an admin or not, they'll actually have a completely separate admins table. So that way it's more secure. It's like less likely that you're gonna have like someone accidentally get access to things that they shouldn't. So there are like some reasons to go that path where you have like a separate table dedicated to a specific role. I think it gets tricky when you have 20 different roles or something like that, and now you like trying to manage all of the content between 20 tables might get really like cumbersome. So with the exception of like the security portion, I would probably try to like adhere to some sort of join table that associates the user with a role, if possible.
Okay.
That said, there are going to be scenarios where it's not possible, and you're going to want to separate it out.
Okay.
Cool. So let's start to sketch out what our new approach might look like. So rather than store the role here, this eraser you gave me, Zach, is no good.
I know. It was a plant just to see if you noticed.
All right, so then we got roles, and so like what we might do. Actually, before I do roles, I'm gonna do user roles, because we technically don't need a roles table, and I want to talk about that first before we start sketching that out. So we might have like an ID, and then we might have a user ID. But what we could do is we could still store role as an enum. So like same way that we did it before, but now instead of having one role, we could set up a has many relationship where a user has many roles. And then they could kind of like be many roles. This would mean that all of the roles would be stored inside of this user role model, right? So you'd have a user role model, and you do the enum thing there. So like enum role, and then you'd put all of the roles inside. That's like I actually probably would try to build it that way personally, but I want to show you a different way because you probably haven't seen it yet, and this is the way I've seen it on some production projects. And so since you've worked with enums in the past and done it this way, I want to show you like another like way to do this, and that would be to have a has many through relationship where you set up a roles table, and maybe you have like an ID and a name, and so it might be like 1 admin, and then over here instead of having role, it would be role ID, and so now you might have like 1, 1, and then 1. That would mean that this user is an admin. if we had another user, or another role, let's just say registered, it's now possible for this same user to be both registered and an admin. Where this starts to matter is like if you start gaining additional responsibilities with like each of these. What's kind of like different about this example here, and probably not such a great example, is that an admin probably can do everything that a registered user can do, right? So it's a little bit more like this permission has everything that this previous permission had. Where this starts to become a little bit more important is if you have roles that are like kind of like it's like less of a direct hierarchy and like a little bit more like across teams and stuff like that. So maybe you have something like manager, and maybe you have something like I don't know, maybe like HR, like human resources or something is a role, and maybe people who happen to have the HR role can see certain things that other people in the organization can't. Maybe software developers have like access to information that other people don't, or something like that. This is going to be very different from like one project to another, and could be like there are no like set rules. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at like a really simple implementation of something like this. It might be that, and it's actually probable that you'll want to start storing other information in this join table as well. So like you might want to keep track of like the store that they're a manager of, or maybe a department that they happen to belong to, or something like that. You might want to start storing additional information here, or somewhere else. You might have like a credentials table that is like stores like the department that they belong to, and like some other information there. Hard to say exactly how this will shake out, so I'm going to do the most stripped down version of this and give you a base to work from. And then from there you can kind of like take it and bend it and adjust it to whatever you need to do. I think that's a pretty good intro to what we're about to get into. Anyone heard of has and belongs to many?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone used it?
I did once.
Anyone know the pros and cons? Like why we would probably not use has and belongs to many?
It doesn't have a model for the join table, so if you have extra info on the join table, you wouldn't get it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I haven't used it in a long time because it was kind of like one of those things where it's like, why would I use this? Because I can just use I could use has many through, and it's gonna work for everything I need this to do, and then give me flexibility in the future. But let me like explain at least the last state when I looked at has and belongs to many where it was at. That basically we don't end up with a model representing this data, and so everything in the middle in that join table, instead of doing like has many, so on the user model, we would do something like has many. User roles, and then we would do like has many roles through user roles, right? This is what I prefer, but there's also this like has and belongs to many, and you can do like roles like that, and this will work. But the way that it works is that you don't get a model in between. So basically you don't do the has many and the has many through. You just do this one line. It makes an assumption about the name of the table. So what it's going to look for is the two things that are associated with each other. So in this case, role and user. And it's going to look for a table in the middle that is going to be alphabetized based on the two models. So the thing that occurs alphabetically first, so in this case role would be the first part of the table name, and then underscore users. Does So I think it would be like role users or roles users. I forget if it's plural.
It's roles users now. It changed in 5.0.
Okay.
It used to be singular plural, but now it's plural.
Plural.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the. It never made sense to me that it was like singular plural. It was like a little confusing. Yeah, well, that's cool. I didn't actually know that it changed.
Yeah.
So it makes the assumption that you're gonna have a join that's named that. What's really interesting about this is there is no ID column. At least there didn't used to be. Any idea? There's no ID column, no created at column, and no updated at column. So the only two things in this table are the role ID and the user ID.
Do you need to make a migration to create the join table?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll have to create the table. So the problem with it is that, like, let's say you start building with has and belongs to many, and then we have something like this where we start to need to like add additional fields to it. We now have to change it from has and belongs to many, go create migrations to add additional columns to that table, and now we have to also go update the models and stuff. And it's like a little bit, it's like extra work with like no real benefit. We didn't really gain much from doing this to begin with. So general consensus and like my recommendation is avoid has and belongs to many, specifically because like this is a really good example of like a scenario where we might start needing to store additional information on this join that we might not need right now, but we want to build with that flexibility in mind. That said, I have seen people on the job use this in scenarios where like we know we're never going to have any additional information stored on that. If that's your choice, that's fine. I would just say like I would err on the side of flexibility and maintainability and just say go with has and belongs, or go with has many through instead. Cool. So this is what we'll build out. We're gonna go with a users table, a roles table, and we'll specific role. We're not gonna introduce like stores or anything like that and try to add like layers of complexity because that starts to get less reusable. So everything here will be reusable like on your projects and stuff like that. And then you can add in additional complexity or flexibility if your app needs it. Everyone good? Cool. Let's take a quick pause and then we'll get back to it. We'll start writing some code. Is the thing recording?